Long ago, in the heart of a powerful kingdom, ruled a king unlike any other. His word was law, his gaze alone could make the bravest warrior tremble. He was feared, and he loved it. But power, period, real power, is never enough. The king was obsessed, not with gold, not with land, but with control. One day he declared, "No man shall ever rise against me, I will rule for eternity." And so he sought the wisdom of the ancients. But what he did not know was that his fate had already been sealed by a mere slave. Inside the great palace, beneath towering pillars of stone, the king sat on his golden throne. His warriors stood guard, their swords gleaming in the torchlight. Servants moved like shadows, their heads bowed, their hands trembling as they worked. But among them was one who did not shake, one who did not cower. His presence was different, unsettling. The other slaves whispered about him. Some claimed he was cursed, others believed he was something more, a man who knew things he should not. The king had never noticed him before, but tonight, something about this slave caught his eye. The way he moved, slow, deliberate, the way he stood, proud, unafraid, the way his eyes met the king's, without fear. For the first time, the mighty ruler felt something he had never known, a strange, uneasy feeling deep in his chest. Doubt. He leaned forward, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Who are you?" The room fell still. Even the torches seemed to flicker in anticipation. The slave met his gaze, his voice calm. "I am no one, my king, just a humble servant." But the king knew better. His fingers curled around the armrest of his throne. This was no ordinary man. And as the flames danced in the silence, the king realized something else. For the first time in his life, he was afraid. The great hall was silent, not a single whisper, not a single breath. The king's fingers tightened around his golden staff. He had ruled for decades, crushed rebellions, conquered kingdoms, and yet this one man, a mere slave, had shaken something deep within him, a trick, a test, or something more. He leaned forward, his voice cold. "You look at me as if you do not fear me." The slave did not flinch. "I do not fear you, my king," he said, "because I know something that you do not." The court gasped. A ripple of unease spread across the hall. The king's jaw clenched. His voice was lower now, dangerous. "And what is that?" The slave stepped forward, his chains rattling softly. He met the king's gaze with unwavering certainty that even the greatest of rulers can fall. Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence, then a laugh, a low, rumbling laugh from the king. But his eyes held no amusement. "You speak boldly for a man in chains?" he said. "Tell me, slave, do you know what happens to those who speak too boldly?" The slave tilted his head slightly, as if weighing his words. Then he smiled. "Yes, my king, they are remembered." The laughter stopped. The court shuddered. For the first time, the king felt it again. That creeping feeling, that whispering thought, doubt, and something far worse, fear. The air in the great hall had changed, heavy, cold, as if unseen eyes were watching. The king shifted on his throne, his grip tightening. "You speak in riddles, slave," he said, his voice edged with irritation, "but riddles will not save you." The slave remained still. "I do not need saving, my king, but perhaps you do." The torches flickered. A gust of wind seemed to snake through the chamber, though no doors had opened. The courtiers murmured, uneasy, restless. Even the guards, trained to show no fear, exchanged wary glances. The king slammed his hand on the throne's armrest. "Enough of your games. Speak plainly, or I will have your tongue." A slow smile spread across the slave's face, not of defiance, but of certainty. "You may take my tongue, my king, but it will not change what is coming." Silence, deep, unsettling. The king narrowed his eyes. And what, slave, do you believe is coming? The slave raised his chin, his voice as steady as the earth itself. The day when even a king's soul is no longer his own. The hall seemed to darken. The flames wavered. Somewhere, deep in the corridors of the palace, a distant echo rang out, a sound that did not belong. The courtiers stiffened. The king's breath came slower now. For the first time, he was beginning to wonder, had this man come to serve him, or had he come to warn him? The king's chest rose and fell, his breath slow, controlled, and yet something deep within him stirred. The slave's words clung to the air, unseen but heavy, like a storm waiting to break. A king's soul no longer his own, a mere trick, a madman's delusion, or a truth he did not wish to hear. The king leaned forward. His voice was quieter now, but it carried the weight of a man who was not used to fear. What do you mean? The slave lifted his gaze, and for the first time, the flickering torchlight revealed something unsettling in his eyes. He was not afraid. My king, the slave said, his voice unwavering, there are forces greater than crowns and swords, greater than armies and gold. The wind groaned through the palace walls. The king's fingers twitched. He had conquered lands, shattered kingdoms, but now standing before him was a man bound in chains. And yet, he had never felt smaller. Enough, the king muttered, shaking his head. You speak nonsense. The slave only smiled. Then why, my king, do you look afraid? A sharp gasp from the courtiers. The king shot to his feet, his hand gripping the hilt of his sword. I fear no man. The flames on the torches shuddered violently, as if something unseen had passed through them. The slave exhaled slowly. Good, he whispered, because it is not a man that is coming for you. The entire hall fell still. Even the shadows seemed to listen. The king's breath came faster now. His fingers twitched against his sword hilt. Not a man, he scoffed, though his voice lacked its usual certainty. Then what, slave? What foolishness do you speak? The slave's gaze did not waver. A force beyond your rule, my king. Something you cannot command, cannot kill. The wind howled through the chamber, rattling the tall windows. A guard stepped forward, gripping his spear. Shall we remove him, my king? The king hesitated. Why? He could order this man's execution in a breath. And yet, somewhere deep inside, something told him this was no ordinary warning. The slave took a slow step forward, the chains on his wrist barely making a sound. You have built your kingdom on blood, my king, on broken oaths and stolen lives. The king's grip tightened. You dare... The torches flickered wildly. The shadows stretched longer. The air itself seemed to grow heavier. The courtiers shrank back. The slave's voice was calm, unshaken. And now something has come to collect its debt. A loud, boom out, echoed outside. Lightning flashed through the high windows, illuminating the hall in a stark white glow. And for the first time, the king's hand trembled. Night had fallen, but the king found no rest. He stood by the grand window of his chamber, staring at the storm that raged outside. The rain lashed against the glass, and thunder grumbled in the distance. Yet, it was not the storm that unsettled him. It was the silence within his own walls. He turned. The golden braziers flickered, casting long, trembling shadows. The silk curtains swayed, though no wind touched them. Something was wrong. Then, a sound, soft where subtle, a whisper. The king's breath hitched. He spun, expecting to see a lurking assassin. But there was nothing, just his reflection in the window. And yet, his reflection did not move. A chill crept down his spine. His own face stared back at him. And for the briefest moment, his own eyes seemed different, dark, hollow, as if something was looking through him. His pulse pounded in his ears. He turned away, shutting his eyes. Enough, he muttered, his voice low. Enough of this madness. But as he stepped toward his bed, the whisper came again. Only this time, it spoke his name. The king jolted awake. His chest heaved, his skin clammy with sweat. The room was silent, too silent. The torches burned low, their flames weak and struggling. The air itself felt thick, pressing against his skin like unseen hands. Then a sound, low, hollow, like a distant wail carried on the wind. The king's breath caught. It was coming from the halls outside, slowly, step by step. It was getting closer. The shadows in the corner of his room twisted unnaturally. He threw off his covers, rising from his bed. His hand reached for his sword, but when his fingers wrapped around the hilt, the metal was ice cold, colder than it should be. A chill crawled up his spine. Then a whisper, not from outside, from inside the room. The king turned sharply, but there was nothing, just the flickering torches and his own pounding heart. He exhaled, forcing himself to step forward, but as he did, the shadow in the corner moved. It did not shift like a trick of the light. It crawled toward him. The king's grip tightened around his sword. His breath was shallow, measured, but no matter how still he stood, something was moving. Not in the room, in the darkness itself. The torches flared violently, stretching his shadow across the chamber walls. But something was wrong. His shadow did not move with him. His heart pounded. Then, a whisper, soft where cold, right behind him. He spun, but the room was empty, and yet he was no longer alone. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. The silence was deafening. Then, from the depths of the shadows, a voice, low, hollow, ancient. It did not echo. It did not belong to the living. It spoke only one thing, his name. King! His stomach dropped, his throat tightened. The sword in his hand felt suddenly useless. Then before he could move, the torches died and the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness was absolute. Not a single flicker of light remained. The king could hear nothing, not the wind, not his own breath, not even his heartbeat. Then, a spark, a pair of eyes glowing red, piercing through the void. The king staggered back, his breath caught in his throat. A figure emerged from the shadows, its form shifting like thick black smoke. It was tall, unnatural, its presence pressed against the air, suffocating. Then a voice, low, echoing, but it didn't speak through the air. It spoke in his mind. "You are weak, king." The king clenched his jaw. "I am not afraid," he growled. A hollow chuckle rippled through the darkness. "Then why do you tremble?" The king tightened his grip on his sword, but the figure only loomed closer. "Your fate has already been decided," it whispered. The king's breath hitched. He felt it, the weight of something unseen, pulling at his soul. Then, the figure leaned in, its voice a chilling promise. "I can spare you." The king's blood turned to ice. "In exchange, you will give me something in return." Silence. Then, barely above a whisper, "What do you want?" The figure grinned. The torches suddenly roared back to life, and the answer came. "Your legacy." The king's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths. His sword felt heavier now, useless. The shadowy figure watched him in silence, its eyes burning red. It was patient. It knew. The king had no other choice. The silence stretched. Finally, the king spoke. "If I give you my legacy," he whispered. A grin curled across the figure's smoky face. "You will live." The king's fingers twitched. He had conquered empires, crushed rebellions, bent entire nations to his will, and yet, here, in this cursed chamber, before this unholy presence, he was nothing. He could feel it, a pull deep in his chest, his name, his legend, his place in history. It was slipping away thread by thread. "If I agree," the king's voice was hoarse. "What will happen to me?" The figure took a step closer. Its voice slithered through the air. "You will live, but you will be forgotten." The king's breath caught. "No statues, no songs, no memory of your name." The king's pulse pounded in his ears. His hands trembled. All his victories erased, all his glory undone. But if he refused, he would not live to see another sunrise. The figure extended a clawed hand. Waiting, the torches flickered, the walls closed in. The king swallowed hard. Then he let go of his sword. The moment his fingers touched the shadow's hand, a chill ran through his veins. The torches flickered, then vanished. A wind howled through the chamber, carrying whispers, fading, forgotten. The king gasped. His body felt lighter, weaker, as if something deep within him was unraveling. His throne, his kingdom, his very name vanished into the void. The palace walls cracked, crumbling. The ground beneath his feet trembled. And then, silence. Far away, where his kingdom once stood, only ruins remained. No statues, no scrolls, no memory of his reign. The winds carried away his name, and with it, his legacy, because power without honor is an illusion, and no ruler, no matter how mighty, can escape the judgment of time. And so, his name was lost to time, a king who believed himself untouchable. But even the strongest walls crumble, even the mightiest rulers fall, because power built on fear is like sand. It slips through your fingers, leaving nothing behind. In the end, no wealth, no throne, no army could save him. For the greatest force in this world is not power. It is wisdom. It is kindness. And it is the stories we leave behind. Africa's past whispers to us, its wisdom carried in the wind. Did this story awaken something in you? Then let us know your thoughts in the comments. We read them all, and tell us, what tale should we tell next? Your voice shapes our stories. If you believe these tales should live on, then don't just watch. Be part of the legacy, like subscribe, and share this story with someone who needs to hear it, because legends never die. Not when they are told. This is Dot, Tales of Africa 99.